Okay. Alrighty. Okay. There we go. Welcome back. Okay. Yeah. Oh, there's more people than I thought would be here. Okay. Especially when I heard that Tory was like shut down, and I'm like, oh God. I don't have any classes in Tory until this afternoon, but it was still a weird thing to hear. Okay. So we're going to keep talking today about kind of the history of youth and childhood. So we're going to finish up with Postman's account and then kind of move on to, just a history of youth and childhood that picks up, basically at the beginning of the 19th century, all right? So about the, or beginning to middle part of the 19th century, so the 1800s, and just sort of start to trace forward some of the more recent developments in a kind of notion of childhood. But we ended off the class on Friday, I think we ended off here, but we'll jump back there. Just kind of talking about how Postman's account of the fact that technology, right, and in this case really the printing press had this long kind of slow transformational kind of effect on notions of childhood, right? That basically with the printing press and its transformation of the information environment in, at the end of the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and then kind of into what we would properly call modernity, we start to get, a notion of childhood that gets longer and longer over time, right? Starts out, I feel like there's too much echo here. Hang on. That's better. Yes, okay. It starts out not much different, but over a kind of 400-year span where, in order to enter adulthood, right, to participate in the economy in meaningful ways, you need to be able to read. What you then get is this kind of slow spreading out and lengthening of this idea of childhood as this period of innocence, right? And of essentially being sort of delayed from entering the adult world, particularly economic life, right? And this notion kind of builds up over time. Now, as I said last time, it takes a really long time and it doesn't appear all at once or evenly in every single place, right? It kind of starts to pop up most noticeably in England first with, the expansion of the middle class. So you can think of childhood very much as a middle class phenomenon, right? Where there's a middle and upper class phenomenon, but it's the expansion of the middle class, in England that makes it possible for it to become this widely adopted kind of set of ideas. So you can thank the English for more things than you could probably imagine. You also, part of this expansion, right, is there's more resources to invest in children, right? If you're not starving, you don't have to necessarily put your children to work. You can delay their entry into the economic life of the family or of the community in major ways, right? So you can have them be innocent for longer. You can have them be educated for longer as you get more and more prosperous. So along with print, right, and all of the other things that come with it, right, the agricultural and then the industrial revolution that makes food more available and that makes goods cheaper, and easier to produce, you get this expansion of the notion of childhood. And you get, according to Postman, this split. As people have more money, they build larger houses, right? They build bigger estates, multiple rooms, if you're talking about the elites, right? Smoking rooms and special places where you can discuss, public events, right? And you get this split between the public sphere and the private sphere. Children, for the most part, get relegated to the private sphere, right? Where they kind of, or the domestic sphere, right? They live in the home. You have this idea of, children are meant to be seen, not heard. And they're limited, they don't get to know kind of private knowledge, right? Things like politics, sex, religion, all of these things get sort of marked off from, children, and in a lot of cases, women, right? One of the ideas behind the smoking room was all of the men would go off to the smoking room and drink whiskey and talk about economics and politics, and leave their wives and the children, off out of that kind of conversation, right? I mean, if you've ever seen like Downton Abbey, you kind of have an idea of what this sort of looks like in a stylized way. So Postman thinks, right, shame makes an important return as a category here, that it's shameful to tell children about things they shouldn't know. Okay. So, like I said, this, yeah, please, Mia.
Since women and children are in the private sphere, like, are women not supposed to know things, or is it really just children?
There's a lot of things that, especially like in Victorian society, women are also not supposed to know about, right? Now, that doesn't mean they didn't, right? But at least like in polite company, you shouldn't be discussing politics or economics in front of women, right? Their sphere was more the domestic in that time, right? Or that's the ideology. And then men, it was, properly being out in the public sphere and discussing politics and all of those things. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, so industrialization, continues this kind of split, right? It really increases the wealth of the middle and upper classes, right? They get a lot richer, and so they get to have children who have this delayed childhood and, who are doted upon by their parents. The lower classes don't as much. But then, towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, something rather extraordinary happens in that, people in the upper and middle classes looking at their own children and seeing, these innocent creatures, start to look at the children of the lower classes, right, the working class and the poor, as children as well. And something kind of gets, awakened in them, in the sense that these young people need to be protected and given the same things that their children have. And here, in lots of ways, we have and again, it takes a really long time for this to play out, right? It's going to take a century and a half, from the beginning of the 19th century till the middle part of the 20th century in lots of ways. But you get the birth of some of the beginnings of aspects of the welfare state, right? The idea that, children need to be somehow protected, nurtured, and if their parents aren't able to do that, then the state has to step in. Now, there's a lot of other complications that happen, right? And some of them are ideological, right? Starting to see your own kids as these special, unique snowflakes that need to be protected. Some of them are a little bit more practical, and I'll talk about them in a few minutes. With a large working class, especially in cities, prior to contraception, you have a lot of children kind of running around with not much to do. Sometimes they're under the care of their parents. Sometimes their parents have died. Sometimes they've been abandoned by their parents. But they are, essentially sort of roaming the streets and in a lot of cases getting into trouble, right? Especially in the working class. Both parents are working, right? Father's probably off at a factory job of some kind, and mother is probably working in the home, doing something that we would call piecework, right? In a lot of cases, some kind of factory work that is shipped off to the household, and she does it from home while she's caring for young children and such. So things like, the final step of sewing some of the shirts, some of the finer details, probably is done by women in their own homes. It's then picked up, and basically they get paid, a penny or 10 cents per, shirt that they've stitched, right? So all of these sorts of things are happening, but everybody's involved, again, when you're poor in economic life. So no one's watching the children, and it starts to create a lot of social problems because they do things like form gangs and commit crimes and get into trouble, which then, really leads to, the middle and upper classes starting to be like, we need to do something about this child crime problem. So you get, in the 19th century and then into the beginning of the 20th centuries, things like in both the US and Canada, what's called the child saving movement, right? Where actually there are people who are committed to this idea that we have to save these children from their own terrible parents, right? Okay. Yes, please. So it's kind of about 1850 to about 1930, roughly. Yeah. Okay. Questions? Did I have I thought that was good. Okay. So some important ideas that kind of emerge, through particularly into the Enlightenment and the 20th century. And these are some ideas that Postman essentially flags as being really critical. So the first one comes from John Locke, right? And this is the idea, and in some ways, right, this idea is still with us. Hang on, let me get my highlight. Whoops, I went the wrong way. I want my highlighter. I've broken everything. Highlighter, give me. Okay. All right, so this idea here, what's called the Tabula Rasa, right, comes from John Locke, right? And basically, this ends up being a really, really, really critical idea in a lot of Western thought about children, right? So, kind of entering into debates, right, that have been going on for a long time about the nature of children, the nature of human beings in general, right? Going back, okay, I'm going to throw this way farther back than I probably need to, but going back to, the 5th century AD with Augustine, the famous Catholic philosopher, right, who thought, who came up with the concept of original sin, right? This idea that all humans have a sort of depravity in them. Coming into the Enlightenment, right, people like Locke start to rethink a lot of these, ideas about human nature and looking at children, right, specifically, and again, coming from a point of view, of someone who's trying to teach children, literacy. Locke comes up with this idea that a child's mind is a blank slate, right? This idea of like tabula rasa literally just means blank slate in Latin. Okay, what does this mean, right? Basically, that a child arrives into this world, not in the case of like what Christianity would suggest, marred by original sin and oriented towards evil, and depravity and sin and all of these things, but actually as a kind of blank, right? Nothing written on this slate at all, right? That human beings come into this world and then they are formed by the influences around them, right? So you can think of this almost in a way as a proto kind of, functionalist sort of way of thinking, right? That social structures are the things that sort of shape young people's minds, right? So if you took SOC 100, right, and you remember Emile Durkheim and functionalism, right? Social structures are what kind of socializes people. This is a kind of proto idea of that coming before, but really, kind of in the same vein. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Essentially, there's no bad kids, right? And there's no notion of kind of depravity or original sin or any of those things. That the fault for bad children, right, when children do bad things, comes not from the children themselves or anything about their nature, but the people who were charged with their socialization, right? There's no bad kids, only bad parents and teachers, only people who have done their job poorly in terms of socialization. Yeah, and because the mind is blank, right, it's ultimately shameful to fail to write good things on it, right? So there is a sort of moral impetus put on parents and teachers and whoever else has the opportunity to influence young people, right? That you need to, write good things, that good principles need to be adopted. Now, this idea has a very, very long tail in society. both for, I think, good and bad, right? And in a lot of ways, it remains with us in really, really critical ways. Though I think the notion of human beings as completely blank has been principally, I think, kind of disproven by psychology. Though human beings are very malleable, people come into life with all sorts of orientations. Okay, so, I mean, where does this kind of play out? One of the institutions, we'll talk about, the kind of formation of a lot of these things in a moment. One of the places that this really appears, and it has this sort of long chain, is in public schooling, right? The idea of public schooling in lots of ways comes from this idea of the tabula rasa, right? That somehow, if you can put children into a place where they can be taught things, and one thing that I think we sometimes fail to appreciate about public education is how ideologically oriented it is towards shaping people in particular ways, along things like shared civic values and kind of whatever moral values happen to pertain at a particular moment in time, right? Like if we go back to, okay, so there's this idea that schools need to be shaping students towards things like citizenship, right? Towards things like good morals. And if we go back, say, to look at the beginnings of kind of Canada, and specifically if you think of when Alberta and Saskatchewan were made into provinces, right? One of the big debates with the federal government at the time was around public schooling. And one of the big questions was, and this was one that the French settlers in sort of Alberta and Saskatchewan ended up winning, was whether they would be allowed to keep state-funded Catholic schools, right? Now, what was at stake in that? And obviously Catholic schools are still with us in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. What was at stake in that question was that the federal government saw public education ultimately as a way to shape the citizens of this developing kind of nation, right, of Canada, right, to form them in specifically, because they were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right, Sir John A. forward, essentially, the ruling elites of Canada were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so what they wanted was to shape Canada into a white Protestant kind of nation. And so leaving these Catholic schools that would be allowed to shape, children in sort of Catholicism was seen as a problem. Now, as I said, so the federal government was opposed to Catholic schools in Alberta specifically because they're like, we need to shape this blank slate into a Canadian blank slate, and that's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of final form at the end of the day. Sounds like a boss battle in a video game, but it's the vocabulary I've got. But then, obviously here in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, there were enough kind of Catholics and specifically French Canadian settlers who were deeply Catholic, and they fought back and they won that battle, enshrining, Catholic schools, whatever you think of them, into the Constitution. But that was what's at stake. And this has been what's been at stake in, say, places like the United States, in the public school system, shaping people in civic values, right? There's always been in the US a big kind of focus on American civics. And if you think of, and I'll talk about them a little bit, probably next class, residential schools, right? Residential schools were premised on this same kind of idea, right? That if you could, get Indigenous children into the care of the state before their parents had had time to write, what they would have thought of as the wrong things, right? Indigenous things on that blank slate, you could ultimately shape them into essentially, quasi-white Christian kind of citizens of Canada, very much British in their orientation, before anyone else had a chance to write on that blank slate, right? So grab them when they're 5, 6, keep them in residential schools for as long as possible, with the idea that you're the one then that gets to write on the blank slate. So has a long and I think troubled history, but I think we still see it in public education, right? In all of the debates around what's taught about LGBTQ people or sex ed in schools is all around this idea that you can form people's values in particular ways if you have control over what goes onto that slate. Okay. Other things, right? Other things you can thank John Locke for. Children need to be trained vigorously, both physically and mentally. So I'm going to make the bold claim that you can blame all the horrors you had in phys ed class, in junior high and high school. You can partially blame on John Locke because it was like, well, we need to train you vigorously, both physically and mentally. So you need to have gym class. I shouldn't say that. Especially my 11-year-old son loves gym class. It's his favorite. And then ideas like shame and credit are essential for Locke, right? You basically, it's a very simple kind of Skinner boxy kind of way of thinking about people. If you want them to behave in a certain way, give them, credit. And if you want to discourage other views, you shame them, right? So when you get that C+ in a class and you feel bad, or maybe that makes you feel good, I don't know, or a D, right? The idea is, right, you're being rewarded for doing well in school and for putting in that effort. And if you get an A, right, you get the credit for it, you feel great. And if you do bad, you get a D, you feel terrible. So grades in some way evolve from this notion, right? It's no longer about just teaching people information for information's sake. It's ultimately about shaping them by this kind of sense of credit. There's also a meritocratic idea that we get, from people like Smith. But, let's not worry about that. Okay. So, another idea that sort of shapes our modern idea of childhood in major ways, ironically, and I say ironically because he was an awful human being, just a complete, anyway, piece of human garbage, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau, in this book, Émile ou de l'éducation, or Émile or On Education, writes about the nature of children. And I always find this ironic for Rousseau because he had this elevated view of children, but he had many of his own children, most of whom he abandoned, right, and sent off to orphanages. So while he had this very, high notion of children, he didn't seem to like children very much or have much use for them in his own life. So always a little strange. Okay, what does Rousseau say about children? Okay, so amongst other things, Rousseau had this notion of children that they are a good in and of themselves, right? They're not a means to an end in the way that you might think Locke is proposing, right? The means to having a functional and great society is children. Rousseau thought of children as a good in and of themselves. And he had this sort of very strange notion. It comes out of a movement called the Romantics. And the Romantics, unlike what the name would suggest, it had nothing to do with our kind of modern notion of romance. It had much more to do with a sort of elevated notion of nature, right? The Romantics really loved kind of nature, the natural world in its unmodified, untrammeled kind of form, right? So what Rousseau basically said about children, right, is that they are the closest thing in human beings to the state of nature. And because he's a romantic, right, he views the state of nature as being, as close to perfection as possible. Specifically, what is interesting about children to Rousseau is their dynamism, their energy, their strength, and their joy. So basically, he thinks, children naturally have this sort of boisterous, unending energy. And I have a 4-year-old, and I can tell you this is absolutely true. He can run circles around me, and after I've collapsed in complete exhaustion, he will run circles around my sleeping body. Adorable, but exhausting at the same time, right? This kind of untrammeled energy. It's also incredibly unfocused, right? It just kind of goes everywhere. But Rousseau viewed that as the ultimate kind of value of youth. And I mean, we still get this, right? We still get this kind of idea from Rousseau in popular discourse, right? Whenever, people suggest things like, that we should listen to young people, right? That young people's voices somehow matter more than, the voices of older people because they are ultimately, the future and they have all this dynamism and energy. Ultimately, you're kind of hearing a cultural echo centuries later of Rousseau and Rousseau's claims. Like Greta Thunberg, right? Whatever you think of her again, Greta Thunberg ultimately is a sort of distant cultural echo of Rousseau, right? Because it's why should we listen to Greta Thunberg? Is Greta Thunberg, an expert in anything? not particularly. But she's young and she has dynamism and energy and she, she has a lot of emotion, right? And it's sort of unchecked by, politeness, right? What is it? We've stolen her childhood, shame on us, right? All of these sorts of things, right? And she looks very angry when she says it. But it's this kind of, like I said, it's this kind of echo of Rousseau, right? That's closest to the state of nature, and the sort of best of humanity is found in youth for that specific reason. So one that really, I think, for a couple of reasons, discounts age and wisdom in lots of ways. And if you could tell, I'm not Greta Thunberg's biggest fan for lots of reasons. Okay, now what Rousseau is really contrasting, this kind of natural energy that young people have too, is the changes in the way children are treated, in his view, coming from the Industrial Revolution, right? And things like school, right? The attempt to put young people in school and to sort of shape them in that kind of John Locke type of fashion into, instruments of the culture and the society towards an end of, making them factory workers or citizens or soldiers or whatever it happens to be, right? And so he basically thinks of school as this place where he's very opposed to the notion of school in lots of ways, where young people go to have their energy and their dynamism sort of sucked out of them and turn them into conformist, I'm freeballing on his language a little bit, but zombies, right? And he has this very different sort of vision, right? That rather than thinking of, young people as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate, you should think of them as a beautiful flower, right? And what should you do, or a plant of some kind, right? A beautiful plant. So what do you need to do, right? And so again, you can see in being a romantic, he's got this very biological kind of language that he's using. But what you need to do is, am I still highlighting? I am. You need to lovingly cultivate it. And education, rather than trying to shape people, needs to be like fertilizer, right? To make what is already there grow, right? So whatever the qualities of a young person are, right, education and society and the way they're treated needs to be like putting fertilizer on it so it grows and becomes more of that same thing, right? Rather than trying to shape everybody into a citizen or a factory worker, you need to find their individual beautiful floweriness and literally just cultivate that into whatever it turns into, right? And again, this is coming, I think, on the bleeding edge of sort of liberal individualism as an idea, right? That everybody has these kind of qualities that make them special, and that needs to be cultivated and shaped, right? If your kid shows an interest in, STEM, you need to sign them up for a STEM camp over spring break so they learn how to code, right? And all of these sorts of things. You can thank in a lot of ways Jean-Jacques Rousseau for these ideas. And that, again, he's not the only one. That liberal individualism and this idea of cultivation of young people's interests and, inclinations, for one, is what gets you paying $250 every 2 months for horseback riding lessons. I speak from experience. But it's this kind of, we need to foster that individual in whatever shape they want to be, right? Whatever their natural inclinations, we need to make them more of that, right? So if they're great at music, we cultivate them as musicians. If they're great at math, we cultivate them as engineers or scientists, all of these sorts of things, right? This idea comes from Rousseau in lots of ways. Okay, sorry, I've blabbed on. Any questions? I haven't had a question slide. I'm gonna go back. Oh, my question slides don't seem to be loading properly. Uh-oh. I'm gonna just check something really quickly and then go back there. Sometimes stuff breaks. At my house, things have been breaking randomly all week, but that's the cold. Oh, maybe I have the wrong. Something is not right. You can't see anything. I promise I'll bring it back in a sec. Okay, there are no questions. Yay, happy days. Okay. Everything's still broken. All right. See, I know how to fix everything. Okay, sorry, I've blabbed on for two things. Oh, no. Every year, I have to talk about Sigmund Freud and his crazy bullshit. Okay. Oh, sorry. If you could tell, what is my attitude about Freud? I don't like him. And yet, despite the fact that he was a vicious pseudoscientist whose ideas have been thoroughly disproven and shown to be just whatever he felt at the time, right? Freud remains incredibly influential in lots of ways. And though we've abandoned psychoanalysis, and anyone who reads Freud today, I think, does it more as a curiosity than to learn anything. I mean, I know you're all half of you are like psychology major minors, and you're like, but we read Freud a lot. And I'm like, I know, and you should not have to. Because there's really, honestly, there's nothing to be learned from this hack. But he still remains incredibly influential. Okay. Oh, so what the hell does Freud talk about? Okay. Well, I mean, aside from the fact that he clearly had issues with his parents, Freud is, because Freud is such a person, I was going to say weirdo, and then I went with person. He has this notion, right, of everything being driven by eros, right? That eros, right, or the erotic, is at the core of human beings in major ways. That this is one of the, this is one of the major kind of driving forces behind the human psyche, right? And somehow, the one that overpowers pretty much everything else, right? So one of the things he thinks is that this is deeply born in basically everybody, right? So what kind of ideas, children have sexual, oh, hey, I'm crossing things out. All right, I'll have to fix that later. I didn't mean to cross that out, I want to highlight. Children have sexuality, right? So just like adults, they are ultimately kind of driven by sexuality, right? And sexual desire that they are unaware of. Freud views children as very much instinctive as well, right? They are driven by kind of base desires, right? Now he breaks this into these categories he makes up for some reason, the id, the ego, and the superego, and I can never remember which one is which. And you know what? It doesn't actually matter because they don't exist. He made them up. So, I'm sorry, I have opinions, if you can't tell. I tell this story all the time, that a few years ago, one of the professors in sociology decided he was going to start a Freud reading group. And I went to the first meeting to tell them that they should stop because no one should be reading Freud ever. And then I left. And I may not have been that person's favorite person. Because I was like, this is dumb. Don't read Freud. It's stupid. And it was, I think the poster had like, we will never be done reading Freud. And I was like, I'm done reading Freud right now. There's nothing to learn from this guy, honestly. So, right, his idea is like somewhere in the id or the ego or the superego, right? We have these deep instincts, right, that drive us towards, eating and pooping and all of these things that Freud is really interested and excited about. And that, basically these make up sort of psychic drives, right? That there's something in the psyche that drives children towards certain impulses that he views ultimately as antisocial, right? So he writes in Civilization and Its Discontents that the whole project of civilization is ultimately to rein in these desires, right? To rein in, the desire to hurt people, the desire to, consume, to be gluttonous, and the desire essentially to have sex with everything, including your mother, apparently, according to Freud. I don't know why. Messed up, man. Messed up people shouldn't write psychology books. But I guess that would probably take like 90% of the psychologists off the field. So there you go. Sorry, I will tell you, I'm hard on psychology because my intro to psychology was Psych 104, where the professor, a grad student, was an admitted nymphomaniac. And so every single class started with her telling us about the most recent sexual encounter she had, which was super fun and not at all troubling. You're like, why are you telling us this? I'm assuming this person got terrible professor reviews. I don't remember their name. I should look it up if I could still find it. But it was funny. Like, looking back on it, hilarious. At the time, like, oh God, this again. Anyway, and very explicit detail. It was a very odd class. Like, to a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds, you're like, What is happening? And like, honestly, it was like 15 minutes at the beginning of each class. It's super fun. Oh, something fell. All right. So, right, everything has to be shaped, controlled and formed. And, one of the things that Freud says is that in order for people to become adults and to be civilized, right, they have to learn to sublimate their base desires, and that this ultimately causes a lot of psychological damage to people, right? That they want these things, right? They want, they have like I said, I don't remember if it's the id, the ego, or the superego, and I don't care. Whichever one it is that's pushing people towards, all of these base desires, they have to sublimate it. But because they do want these things, right, it ultimately leaves them kind of psychologically damaged, which is why, so civilization ultimately kind of, hurts people psychologically. This is why the book is called Civilization and Its Discontents. All right. I know. Freud. I should like draw devil horns on his face or something while I'm here. Oh, Freud. I will say I'm thankful to Herr Sigmund for burning his journals and notebooks before his death, because I can't imagine what depraved crap would have been in there. And if we had been able to see them, we would have been debating and having to read Freud's notebooks and stuff, and it would have been awful. So I'm glad, that he burned them all before his death, knowing that people would be interested. He's like, I'm going to flambe these. And I'm like, oh, thank you. You did one thing right. Okay. Last kind of thinker that Postman flags is this character, John Dewey. And I mean, still someone that talk about in psychology lots of ways. In education as well, Dewey plays a major role. And, amongst other things, Dewey is really famous for this particular notion that children, as a social category themselves have particular needs, and that those needs need to be addressed, right? And again, this is, I think, a little bit of a reaction against particularly this kind of Lockean sort of way of looking at childhood, but in some senses that Rousseauian way as well, right? That there's actually things that children need, right? That they need, a bunch of care. They need a bunch of shaping, right? In order to function, right? In order to be happy, fulfilled people, they need certain things, right? And it can't always be about the future of children, right? And specifically, Dewey is really critical of the notion, I think, that children are some kind of means to an end, right? That ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about the end product, right? The citizen, the worker, and these sorts of things that actually, you need to address children as children at certain points and meet their needs. And you see this very much in kind of modern educational philosophy, right? That in a lot of ways, and it kind of goes in waves, right? Where they try to address children's needs in the moment. This kind of leads to sometimes less good educational outcomes, and then it goes about being about the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Whoever came up with the third R clearly can't spell, so I don't know why arithmetic is the third R, but maybe because it's catchier than 2 R's and an A. I'm gonna guess it's that. But yeah, whatever problem, you see that in modern educational philosophy. Right, a lot of times now, it's about, if you get this phrase, meeting children where they are, right? You've now wandered into the philosophical kind of influence of John Dewey, right? It's not about, no, I need to get them to this place. It's like, I need to meet them where they are at this moment and kind of bring them along. I know, as my wife's an elementary school teacher, and her philosophy, flawed as it is. No, I'm kidding. I always make fun of her. She's like, what do you say about me in your classes? I'm like, nothing, sweetie. But she's like, I get them at a certain point and I get them as far forward as I can, and we just do the best with wherever they were at to wherever they are at the end of the year. And that's a kind of Dewey-ish formula, right? Dewey-ish? Deweyan? I don't know. Who knows? I don't know how to adjectivize Dewey. Because it's like, what do children need, right? Rather than where do we need to get them? And that's sort of the legacy of a character like John Dewey. Okay, so those are some ideas that shape childhood according to these folks. All right, that was a question from last time, which I sort of answered, and I'm going to just leave it there forever. Okay, so we got 10 minutes left, and I got way less done than I wanted to. All right, that's okay. So basically, with Postman, we sort of cover, roughly the middle part of the 15th century to the beginning part of the 19th century. And so we're going to kind of pick it up there. The account in the textbook sort of does, I think, an interesting job of sort of getting us up to more or less the present moment. Okay, so what happens kind of as we enter into the 19th century, and particularly, as we go forward into the middle and later part of the 19th century, is there starts to be more and more focus on discourses about young people, right? People become really interested in the particular qualities of young people, and they start to notice things about them and classify things about their development, about what they need, about who they are, in very much more scientific ways, right? And again, we're moving through into the period, we're past the Enlightenment now into modernity. And so you get things like, Gillies, who discovers the concept of adolescence somewhere between, we're not exactly sure, 1870 and 1900. So this concept of people going through adolescence, right, as this distinct period, and G. Stanley Hall talks about this in terms of Sturm and Drang, it's the period of storm and stress, right? As, and they figure out that hormones exist, right, because blood chemistry is getting more advanced, and they realize that young people are under the influence of hormones, which is why they act so weird. So you get this idea that they're going through this particular period of life called adolescence, which it's not like people weren't aware that something happens around that point in time. It was just no one had ever classed it using a particular word and given it, a scientific explanation. And that's what happens, towards the end of the 19th century. You get the sort of, especially in kind of the English-speaking world, you get a sort of then Victorian way of dealing with things, and particularly around sexuality, right? There's this notion, in some ways, I don't think it's an entirely fair categorization of the Victorian period. Queen Victoria famously, when told by, I think after her 10th child or something, told by her doctor that she should stop having children, replied reportedly, "Am I not to have any fun in the bedroom then?" So, not quite as repressed as you might think sexually. But, the Victorian period gets a lot of flack for being very repressed from the point of view of sexuality. And what you have, right, is the formation of these very strict, you still see this in England in lots of ways, kind of categories around, young men, especially in the middle and upper classes, being very strictly disciplined. And you get then the formation of things, right? And like I said, they still exist. These British boarding schools for, particularly young men. I mean, if you've ever watched The Crown, right, you saw like Prince Charles get sent off to this horrifying school in Scotland, right, that his dad had been to or something. I don't remember. And this is the kind of genesis of this, right? So you get, lots of young British boys sent off to boarding schools, partially because it's like, well, let's keep them separated from young women so they don't get themselves into any trouble, right? And as you get the idea of adolescence and puberty as ways of understanding young people's development, you're like, oh, we really have to manage this phenomenon to keep this kind of propriety around sex. Okay. So, and I kind of mentioned this, so I won't dwell on it too much. And sorry, this best image of youth crime I could find was this picture from the Scorsese film Gangs of New York, with a very dashing looking Leonardo DiCaprio, I guess. All right, so one of the things that happens, right, as I said, is outside of the middle and upper classes, right, when you talk about the working class and young boys and poor boys in particular, you have a lot of crime, right? You have a lot of poverty, lack of supervision, and crime. And this becomes the focus of a lot of public attention, right? There's a lot of like, what are we going to do about these roaming gangs of boys that are ultimately causing all of this social disruption in our society? And, basically the state starts to, okay, there's a religious and ethnic element to this as well. And I'll put it, in very flat categories. Catholics, particularly the Irish, the Italians, and to a lesser degree, Polish people, are seen as the progenitors of this kind of problematic underclass of young people, right? They're poor, they're Catholic, and so the Anglo-Saxon kind of establishment, and it's true, in the UK, it's true in England, in the US, and it's true in Canada, the ruling elites are all, English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And they fundamentally look at a lot of the social disruption and the problems, and they look at, Irish, Italian, French Catholics as being the problem. And it becomes a kind of focus of the state to take care of these problems. So really right at the end of the 19th century, right? And if you've ever taken, SOC 321, one of the kind of early things you learn is that at the end of the 19th century, you get the establishment of the first youth courts, right? Basically, these courts that start to see, okay, we have young people, we clearly need to deal with them in a different way. They're causing social problems. What do we do, right? And so you get, I don't know what that is. I should really turn off my ringer. You get the formation of specific kind of bodies, right? Government bodies that are focused on young people and young people's problems, right? All right. So yeah, a lot of it is male crime, mostly seen as thievery, female crime, seen as solicitation, prostitution, and, in a lot of cases constructed as using their feminine wiles to lead young men astray, right? So a lot of the, focus on correction for young women is about taming their sexuality and making sure that they're shaped in better moral ways. So crime prevention for girls is aimed at saving them from themselves and protecting society from them. You get, weird articulations of this socially, right? In Ireland, unwed mothers are seen as a particular problem, and so they get shipped off to, institutions run by the Catholic Church, the so-called or the famous Magdalene laundries, where they're basically made to give up their children and essentially sort of enslaved, as workers in these laundries. You get the formation, though, too, of youth jails, right? Youth jails, reform schools, industrial schools, all get formed kind of in this period towards the middle to end of the 19th century as ways of dealing with this youth crime problem. And it's really very interesting, right? Because there's an acknowledgement of the problem, and the formation of the correctional institutions slightly precedes the formation of courts, right? And if you look at a kind of chart of it, right, you get the earliest kind of formation of, reform schools or industrial schools, in the 1860s and 70s. And then finally, the institutions of youth courts happen in the 1890s and early 1900s. Okay, 2 minutes left. Why don't I leave it there? And we'll pick it up there on Wednesday when the temperature is supposed to be less horrifying. We'll just keep going with the history of youth and childhood. All right, we will see you on Wednesday. Hello.
I just got in.
Okay.
I was driven by my dad, and we got a flat.
Oh no.
So I was driven by a friend.
Oh shoot.
So I was wondering, these lectures are recorded?
They are, yeah.
Okay.
So,
how can we access the recorded lectures?
oh, I should. Yes, I forgot to show you all. Hang on. Let me just turn it off quickly.
Okay.
I'm gonna turn my microphone off. All right.
At least I made it.
Yeah, you made it to campus. It's not half
But I
bad.
definitely want